guess I'm starting this conversation. Welcome to the fireside chat, um, where we are going to talk about avoiding multiplayer pitfalls. And it's basically a fireside chat where we have stories from Bungie and Doborog and myself, Gameye. I would like to introduce the speakers. Let's start off with Brian Jordan from Doborog. Brian.
Hello, yeah, how's it going? I'm Brian. I'm the CTO, co-founder of Doborog Games. We're a very tiny indie studio whose game Clone Drone in the Danger Zone we've had out in Steam Early Access initially. Game ended up doing really well and growing, and we ended up fully releasing last year onto Xbox, Switch, PlayStation, and kind of along the way as we were developing the game, we added multiplayer to our game, which they say is never do that, but we did the thing you're not supposed to do and did that. And so, yeah, we learned a ton over the kind of intervening few years when we did that. And yeah, so I'm excited to chat about what all we learned. And we definitely have experienced some of the pitfalls that we can talk about. And yeah, I think should be a fun chat. And yeah, hopefully it'll be some of the stuff I wish I knew. I wish I will have seen this call by the time I was starting out. So yeah,
Cool. And then
that's it.
from the Bungie side, I guess a lot of people know the exciting multiplayer games that Bungie has made. Hopefully, some war stories we can hear from Steven. Hi, Steven.
Thank- Thanks, Seb. Yeah, my name's Stephen Claiborne. I have been doing this for like 25 years. I've been in the industry for 15. I started out in the financial industry doing services, and then moved to Ensemble Studios, was there for a little while, was at Robot Entertainment for a long time, Blizzard for a little while, and then I've been at Bungie for about 18 months. So some of my war stories may be from Bungie, and then some of my war stories may be from the previous 20 years. So
Some good experience there. Okay. Cool. Well, I guess there are definitely some pitfalls we could discuss, but let's start off a little bit easy um, with some experiences, as in experiences of how it is to build a multiplayer game. Brian already mentioned that he has it from his perspective, learned a lot along the way. Stephen has done this for 20 years. He is more advanced war stories in there. But what does it actually take to build a multiplayer game? What are the biggest challenge or pitfalls you've came across? Starting with you, Brian.
Yeah. So for us, yeah, outside of kind of just learning how to, write netcode and said, fortunately, I sort of had a web development background before we started, so I understood enough about kind of like, making API calls, setting up matchmaker stuff, and generally how the netcode worked. But yeah, when we started out, we did a bit of research. We had our community. Well, yeah, I guess at the time it was just just me researching how adding multiplayer impacted other games. So I looked up kind of other games that were in early access that had single player, ended up adding multiplayer, and looked at what the review differences were after that. And I think it's pretty well known that like there is a gap between the ratings of games that are multiplayer and single player. I think single player games tend to have higher ratings in general because there's at least on Steam, because there's just so many things that can go wrong with multiplayer games. So I learned a bit about what we were getting into doing that research. Big thing was ping for players. There some of these things are kind of outside of your control. But yeah, big thing for players is if they have bad ping, then that's going to show up in there. If their region distribution is not good, that'll show up in there. And especially lately, players care a lot about that. Just like it doesn't matter if the actual like peer-to-peer multiplayer is like fundamentally a better fit for your game mode. They players will be upset that don't have dedicated servers. So I think for us it was like it seemed like just an important name brand thing to have is like dedicated servers. Yeah, they're like more stable, and yeah, in our case, because it was going to be competitive multiplayer, we wanted to use dedicated servers to be able to have the anti-cheat and also have just like a consistent experience and a fair experience. Because yeah, with kind of peer-to-peer, a lot of the peer-to-peer models, it'll favor one player's latency over the other. Yeah, so that was, I think, yeah, multiplayer reviews. We wanted to think about what the impact on that would be and just player experience in general. And yeah,
and you
yeah.
mentioned something about ping and regions. How fast do reviews come in or bad reviews come in when you are not able to, if it's a dedicated server area, like you cannot um, you cannot service a specific region or a country? How fast are those reviews coming in when yeah a game sort of picks up in that region? What do you do? What happens?
Yeah, I'd say there's sort of two scenarios. So sometimes yeah, so there's sort of like in general, which regions do you offer? And if there's kind of not a good region close to a large segment of your player base, in our case, we had a lot of players in China, a lot of players in Russia, a lot of players, yeah, kind of in that region. We didn't have and also a lot of players on the west coast of the U.S. We didn't have the provider we had initially gone with for the dedicated server hosting didn't initially have a US West region. So pretty much right after we launched multiplayer, there were players who were upset that we didn't have US West, and also true of the kind of not having a region close to China. So yeah, that was definitely there. That those will come in just over time, and it'll come. It's hard to know exactly what the cause of them was, but often it'll come down to ping, and then there's the more acute issues where like if there's many ways that multiplayer servers and matchmaker kind of many possible issues along that path, and if any kind of downtime occurs, those you'll start getting stuff very quickly. Community members reaching out to support, escalating to reviews. That'll happen the same day. And hopefully you have monitoring in place to find out before those steps happen. But yeah, those are the big kind of impacts, and I think where you end up seeing the lack of regions coming to bite you.
And that's a specific, I guess, for the game Clone Drone in the Danger Zone.
Yeah.
Stephen, from your side, you've done this a few times. Bigger games, smaller games. What's top of mind? What of the biggest challenges or pitfalls that you see across the board on all specific games you've gone into? Was it a mobile game or an FPS game, whatever it was? What is a pitfall that you've come across multiple times, or hopefully haven't crossed because you knew about it before? Starting on the next journey.
Yeah, I'm gonna take a small step back and talk a little bit about like SDLC, and then like we can get into tech. But I think a lot of this for me starts with the software development lifecycle, and really starts with like how you conceptualize and how you approach running games as a service. Because whenever I hear, like, for me multiplayer is synonymous with studios that want to run games as a service. And that was really interesting. That the interesting thing for us when we started Robot Entertainment was a lot of us came from Ensemble Studios, and Ensemble Studios was very much a boxed product studio, right? We would ship an Age of Empires game, and then we would take a month off, and then we would come back and we would figure out how we were going to ship the next Age of Empires game. And so it was a fairly like heavy lift for us to figure out. When we got to Robot, we were like, okay, we want to do games as a service. We really believe in that revenue model. And so how do we make that shift? And I think there were a few interesting lessons that we learned on how to approach games as a service, and how to like develop sustainably, versus like just going full out and then shipping a game and then taking time off, right? And so I think that sustainability piece is the biggest one to bear in mind. And we actually like constantly at Bungie, we're talking about the same thing at the leadership levels, where it's how do we make sure that we're paying down tech debt? Because unfortunately, when you're building a games as a service game, almost immediately the first line of service code that you write is almost tech debt, right? Like you're going to ship it, hopefully, but you have to support it for the next 10 years. And so how do you build services in a way that allow you to be flexible, but also build them reliably and actually ship something, right? And those are really hard. Those are really hard problems to solve. And it kind of does start with the software development lifecycle and making sure that like production and art and design and engineering are all on the same page about the goals that engineering has, that you have dedicated time in sprints or in whatever your milestones look like in order to pay down tech debt. And the thing that I've consistently found, which I don't know if this is just me, but the thing I've consistently found is making sure that you build in time for service iteration. Because I've never successfully shipped the first version of a service. So like if I think back on matchmakers that I've built, or think back on lobby services that I've built or chat systems that I've built, it was always the third iteration basically that was the one that stood the test of time and that we actually like kept for a long time. The first couple were not necessarily throwaway, but they were definitely got eaten up in the iteration mill that is video games. So I think that those like building in that time and making sure that you're at the forefront, that you're correctly allowing for that iteration cycle is super important, because otherwise you can fall behind, and then once you fall behind, catching back up is super hard.
Just to jump in real quick, I think our context is so different because we're tiny indie team adding multiplayer that started growing, and I think at the time we had sort of not. Yeah, I think we had sort of been sold on the like web app, simple, like, oh, you want to add multiplayer, here's a simple API, it'll give you matchmaking, it'll give you dedicated servers, just write a good game backend and it'll all work. So I think we sort of were like, okay, this is doable. We can like, imagine how to make that happen, and we did that. But I think, yeah, we definitely way underestimated, in addition to underestimating, how long it takes to refactor your entire single player game into use netcode. I think we underestimated that we were taking on that, ultimately taking on that software system as our own. And yeah, we ended up eventually getting bit in many different ways and locations of just keeping things up, and in the face of those kind of like upstream systems showing their own cracks of just oh, they have random day or few days of downtime, and like how do we deal with that, where things were sort of outside of our control. And eventually we ended up having to take even more things in house and kind of write our own matchmaker, urgently transition to a new service provider. So it was like we didn't think that there would be all that future work. I think that's something that, looking back, we're like, oh yeah, really got a budget in a lot of future time to maintaining the multiplayer backend system, and yeah, learned all slowly by making those mistakes. And yeah,
What I can hear in both stories is something very interesting. Is Steven said the third iteration is always the one that gets close to what we wanted to achieve. And Brian, you say you moved away from third parties and building your own tools, your own matchmaker. So how important is that you have full access to changing things on the flow, or being able to change things that you have in control? Because if you look at what's happening in the market, it's also about third parties use our services because it's all magically gonna work. Is that then a pitfall, or like at what point do you decide keep that in house, or and save some time on another third party tool? You can go somewhere else. How important is it to be able to maintain things yourself, have it in house or outside or third parties, and jump into it when things go wrong?
So one thing actually that I wanted to touch on real quick before that, Seb, that Brian just brought up, which I think is super salient, especially for like newer developers that are just like figuring out how to do multiplayer, is
Right.
you talked about like starting single player and then going to like retrofit a single player game with netcode, right? And that's something that I've done a dozen times or more, and it's a really hard problem. And there's two super interesting pieces that like you have to bear in mind as you're thinking about that, right? Because one of the things, especially when you're prototyping a new game, one of the things that you're trying to figure out the fastest is this fun or not?
Right.
Right. And like, if it's fun, great, then let's figure out how to like make this a marketable product. If it's not fun, then let's figure out either how to iterate and make it fun, or let's figure out how to move on to a different idea. Right. And
Right.
so one of the most interesting pieces of that is, okay, so we have a multiplayer game that we're making. Do we start out with real multiplayer in order to find the fun? Because real multiplayer is a much larger investment in every single aspect, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's harder to design, it's harder to implement, it's harder to iterate on, it takes more time because it's all real and you have to maintain, like, multiplayer is just harder than single player.
Oh
And
yeah.
so
At least 4
I
times,
think
I
there's
would
some
say.
really, yeah. And so there's some really hard questions that you like have to ask yourself as developers when you're contemplating that, of, are there ways that we can, in a single player context, are there ways that we can figure out if the core concept of the game is fun, or do we really need to take the time investment in order to uh, in order to in order to develop the multiplayer, because that's really where the fun is in those multiplayer interactions. And so um, I think that's another super important one, where it's really easy, and I've done it before on teams that I've been on, where we've glossed over and we've been like, no, we're just going to do single player because it's the fastest thing. And then we came to regret that later, because when we actually went to convert, like, because physics was such a huge piece of the simulation, or because like the fact that combat felt really good with zero lag was such a
Right.
huge piece of the gameplay. And then when you introduce 30 or 40 or 50 milliseconds of lag, it totally changes and breaks combat. Like, there's just all those
Yeah.
different things that um that you really need to think about as a team, and as a leadership body, as you're getting into the prototype, to figure out what the right pathway there is.
Right.
Anyways,
Yeah.
I
No,
wanted
yeah.
to bring that up.
That is a super salient point. Yeah, I think I was just thinking along the same lines of yeah, it's like looking back, there's definitely that pro and con of like it's almost existential of like we may not have even ended up making a multiplayer game had we not made the single player game, validated that it's fun in that interaction mode with, you know, easy physics, just relying on Unity physics, uh and yeah, like having zero latency with the enemies. Yeah, in our game, for people who don't know, yeah, it's like super, you're like everything is physical voxels and you're slicing enemies like directly, so like the actual like movement of your mouse while you're
Right.
swinging and your body moving impacts exactly which voxel it hits, and depending on that depends on if your enemy lizard eyes. So it's probably the worst one of the hardest scenarios for those kind of action games. So yeah, and yeah, you intuited, yeah, we definitely had to deal with like how do you make that feel good in multiplayer. So we sort of almost discovered that as like a new game mode, of that game mode is fun, and I think it took a couple iterations of like, we tried duels at first and it was pretty fun and kind of proved out that it could be done, and that it's like there's something fun about playing a real human. And then we ended up adding kind of a little group combat mode that was like, yeah, also pretty fun. It's like kind of chaos and fun upgrades, and then we ended up adding multiplayer co-op, and that one ended up being like, just looking at our usage stats, like the big like almost rivaling the single player game modes, way bigger than the other multiplayer game modes. So yeah, it's like a sort of this like discovery process, and it's like looking back, it would have been much easier to start out doing it in multiplayer, but also, yeah, looking back, it was a lot faster to prototype, figure out what was fun, test it with players by starting out single player. And it's not clear if had we kind of started with multiplayer, if we would have ended up there. And yeah, everything's way more expensive too. Yeah, as in multiplayer, and even just refactoring. We ended up refactoring the single player game to also be written in a similar netcode style, so that kind of functionality would feel similar. And it definitely had also the drawback of increasing the development time of all future single player features, because we need to write them, or players expect things to be in both single player and multiplayer, and just everything is written slightly differently for netcode support. So it definitely increased the cost of everything in the future. But so yeah, being able to shift that all a little bit later in the development cycle was helpful, and probably ended up saving time overall in some ways. Interesting. And
Cool.
yeah, so remind me what you had initially asked. I was
Yeah, I was thinking, like, am I going back to that question, or are we just go to the next one?
I think I had
My
something
question was
around
basically
that.
how important it is to keep full control of what's going, like the key elements
Oh yes,
that you keep
yeah.
control in house or third parties, so that you can iterate
That's
fast, you can jump in fast, solve problems. Sometimes we hear things of third parties not being able to help their customers as fast as possible, meaning that a game could be done for days, hours, weeks.
yeah.
Um, you don't have to share those stories about which third parties or whatever, but more the ability, how important it is to keep things near to you, and when do you go for third
Yeah.
parties, or anything you could share
I
there.
think similar to what Stephen was saying about adding multiplayer in the net code, and how it prototyping in single player can be a lot easier and cheaper and almost existentially important, because you're able to figure out if it's fun sooner, or aspects of it are fun sooner. I think using third party tools, even sometimes that you don't have full control over, can be, like in our case when we were figuring out how do we architect a matchmaker and a dedicated service system. Like I had played with Docker a little bit myself. I knew a little bit about Kubernetes and like all the kind of more like low level open source tools, but it all just felt like all these Lego pieces that I had no idea how to visualize putting all together and how it would all work. So that we were kind of able to build on these more sold to developers as easy tools. I think we were able to learn the kind of the right approach, or the kind of what is the typical approach of for matchmaking and for dedicated server orchestration. But later down the line, we definitely ended up getting bit and needing to and starting to see now the benefits of doing things with tools that you completely kind of control the infrastructure and the tooling that you're using, because when there's downtime that's outside of your control, it's really painful and hard. And it's like, as a developer, I'm used to like, oh, the game's, and it almost like what our players expect, like, oh, the game's down, multiplayer's down, like, are you is your team hard at work fixing it? And it's like, I'm emailing support email emailing a support email and desperately trying to get someone to care at the company to dig into this. Maybe it's a feature only some of us are using, or some issue specific to our account. That feels a lot less like what I'm comfortable doing than like, oh, give me an hour, I'm jumping in, I'm SSHing into something, or I'm fixing some code that we control. Yeah, I think I've come to appreciate more working with the open source tools, low level tools, and just the flexibility that gives you when things do go wrong. It feels like things are a little more in your control, which is nice.
Gotcha. So
Yeah,
basically, your biggest nightmare came true, and based on that, you made some decisions to move to other solutions.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Stephen. Yeah.
Yeah, so,
Oh yeah, no, sorry. So the framework that I always come back to is like core competencies, right? And so I think like my advice here would be sit down and decide what you want your core competencies to be as a studio, right? Or as a technical organization. And then go pursue those, right? So like if and a lot of that core competency conversation will come down to like the expertise you have in house, the expertise that you want to go hire, the people that you have and what they're excited to go work on, right? And so if if you don't have server developers and you don't want to go hire server developers, then you probably don't want to make that a core competency of the studio, and you probably want to go figure out how you partner with an external vendor versus
Right.
if you have people that are super excited about that and you have that skill set in house, then that's probably a pretty good indication that you want to invest in that. And then I think the other way that I think about it, and the way that we talk about it all the time, both at Blizzard and at Bungie, is like, what is mission critical for the game? Because you have like critical path for it to make it so that the game can, so that players can sign in, so that players can pay you, so that players can play the game. Like there's a few different like mission critical path pieces that you probably strategically want more control over because they're important to the business. And then there are other things that, like if your chat system is down and you've architected your game in such a way that like it doesn't take your whole game down just because chat goes offline or whatever, right? Like there are ways to strategically position some of those pieces so that you can have failures, or you can have those individual pieces down without actually taking the entire ecosystem down, right? And so figuring out which pieces are mission critical, which pieces are critical to operating the business, and then figuring out how you architect technical solutions and what pieces of that you own versus what pieces of that you outsource or that you partner.
Really good, framework for thinking about that. Yeah, for us, I think it evolved so much over time too, because there were, initially it was kind of just a couple of us doing the development, and it's like, oh, are we interested in learning about multiplayer? I don't know. And actually, we started out just making a kind of a little game to throw away. Maybe that was our version 1. We don't want to break our single player game that's paying the bills right now, so we're going to make a kind of a throwaway game. We ended up putting it out on Steam for free just because it was a peer-to-peer game, and some players like. So they were sort of like, they ironically liked it, but then like there's a little cult now of players of our throwaway game, Long Live Santa, and they're they'll pop up on Twitter being like, give us Long Live Santa too, and we're like, well, we just made it to learn multiplayer. It's our crappy first stab at it, but it's definitely definitely part of that. Was just like discovery. Do we like it? I think we learned. I think I learned to like even the like writing my own matchmaker. It's I really tried to avoid it. We're like, we don't want to run a web service. We don't want to, have be responsible for this. But we ended up kind of just having to do it out of kind of just how the situation evolved. I'm sorry, there's some construction starting outside, but so it I think I learned to love it, and I think we're kind of now open to, when our new hires have some web experience, they can jump in on that too.
Cool. Of course, when you build your game, you'll have a specific audience in mind, but the audience uses different types of hardware. How much of that is at the beginning you make decisions on? Oh no, let me rephrase it. How difficult is it when you consoles into the equation? Like when you have control of what's going on your side, the client side, but then I can imagine if you run something on a PlayStation or an Xbox, you cannot just change something and then, hey, here's a new version, guys, let's go, upload it, and spread it out to your users. How much of that brought a new equation to building multiplayer, Ryan, from your perspective, building quite an indie type of game, when you ventured into consoles?
That was definitely a very painful learning process too, of release cycles can become way less predictable and longer. And when we try to simul ship stuff, because we have crossplay across all the consoles, we try to you have to think very carefully of, okay, can we add this, and is it okay if it's an old client, and if not, how do we time the release such that it really upgrades all of them at once, or makes it so they can't match with the wrong version. And when stuff would go wrong that requires a client side change, and we wound up in an instance where a tool that we were relying on kind of had a bit of a bit of a web service that they ran, and there was some configuration that they had sort of baked into the game client library, and they had an issue with that where it was pointing to a dead server, and it wasn't configurable. So we ended up having to do a client side change to fix our multiplayer. So it was multiplayer was down. Steam we were able to fix within an hour because they were kind of urgently getting a patch ready for us. Then we submit it to cert for the other consoles, and I'm sending emails. Hello, can you help us fix our game faster by clicking approve? So yeah, it was definitely another one of those scenarios, I think, where you're sending an email instead of writing code to fix something. I know, yeah, the big lesson there is like, in so much as you can. And yeah, part of that's like also if we had written our own library for that piece of stuff, we probably, probably would have been something a little more consistent, or we would have at least known that dependency was there. And then also, I think when writing code that's connecting to web services, make as much configurable as possible, or give yourself as many kind of dials that'll let you recover from issues without requiring client update. So like we started making our matchmaker API endpoint a configurable feature flag type configurable title data, so that we could, even if whatever tool cloud provider we're using for the matchmaker goes down, we could point it to another URL, and using the same API, I could write a new API for it if needed, and not kind of be I've learned to watch my back for stuff breaking and going down, and trying to give myself options for ways to respond to stuff.
Yeah, the even better one is mobile, right? Because you have even less control over when new versions of your product go out, new client versions of your product go out globally. And so with mobile, you even have to, like, the thing that we've done with mobile is, and this is more at Robot Summit Blizzard, is you kind of have to, you basically have to have a routing service that's like, this version of the client talks to this version or these versions of the server. And you really have to be explicit that way, because it's very possible that you'll have 2 or 3 or 4 versions out in production at the same time, because you can't really control when either people upgrade or when the new version goes live. And you can like deprecate, that also gives you a really nice hook to deprecate old versions, because when an old version phones in and is like, hey, what version of the server API should I connect to? You can just be like, hey, you're deprecated. Pop the force upgrade screen, and don't let the client move forward anymore, right? And then I think you hit the nail on the head, Brian, with the suggestion of like config everything, config all things. That is definitely the right path forward. We did that back. I remember when I was working on the Halo Wars matchmaker, and the Halo Wars backend, way back in the Xbox 360 days, we did that, where we could, from server config, we could actually change the variables that the Halo Wars client used when talking with the Xbox matchmaker. And it was super great. Wow. Because we could change, like we could just go in, and within 5 or 10 minutes, we would have changed how our matchmaking buckets within the within the Xbox matchmaker were actually matching people together. And it was super powerful, rather than having to do like title updates or anything. So, and that was, and then we carried that through with all of the rest of our architectures, where we configured everything we could possibly config on the client, so that we had the maximum amount of flexibility.
Very cool. I wanted to ask questions about what could you do differently when starting over again, but I feel we're going too much into the negative sphere of the pitfalls and problems. So I want to shift it up a little bit into something different, and talk about, what are you guys most excited about future-wise, technology-wise, that could really help build multiplayer games in a different way, or things that will really change the future of building multiplayer? And I don't want to hear the words metaverse and blockchains, but more like, what are you, like, simple technologies or open tools that are out there nowadays that you guys are excited about and using, or as Steven said, building actually as a service, or taking these tools into that building a service or game as a service. What are you guys very excited about? What were you keen to get your hands dirty on for if you would build another multiplayer game?
Yeah, yeah. On oh yeah, sorry, I'll jump in real quick. Yeah, on our end for sure, it's been Docker containers and kind of being able to take Docker containers and place them on Google Cloud and Gameye, and be able to kind of create one kind of bundled up version of our game, binary plus any dependencies, have that all stored in code, deploy that, have that version, be able to switch between versions. Yeah, that's been, I think, a really powerful tool, both on the developing stuff, developing the game server binary and having that go out and scale out when we need it. And the nice thing too is you can develop that locally and test locally. And then also for our web services, there's now some great tools where you can kind of work with Docker containers as your primitive and say create a matchmaker web service and not have to worry as much about operating system or the kind of other parts of the computer that your game is running on in theory. Also in theory, but like Google Cloud Run and Amazon has their thing. Fly.io has support for that, and yeah, that's been a really fun primitive, even just for side projects and for our matchmaker. Yeah, we're starting to get more into that. And the serverless world of cloud functions, AWS Lambda. That world's been really interesting, and I've been experimenting a lot with it for our matchmaker. It's definitely got it's writing stuff in a sort of distributed systems way is a whole kind of brings in its own kind of set of challenges and weird corners of services that you kind of also don't control and that you're kind of relying on. But yeah, those have been a couple things that have been kind of exciting for me.
From a strategic perspective, I think the thing that excites me really over the last like 5 years, this has been accelerating, is just the continued commoditization of like server backends and server technologies, because it makes it more accessible, right? Like if you look back 40 years to like databases or relational databases or whatever, right? Like companies that needed a good relational database went and wrote their own, and then like Oracle and Microsoft and IBM and stuff with their various database products kind of commoditized database. Nobody writes their own databases anymore, right? And you've seen it with game engines as well, where 20 years ago everybody was writing their own game engines, and now Unity and Epic and those guys have cornered the market on because they've got really great commoditized products, right? And so nobody writes their own game engines anymore. And you're starting to finally see that, like when I got into the server backend of games 15 years ago, it was very, very custom, right? And there was basically no commoditized platforms or commoditized products out there. And now you have several. You have Excelbyte, you have PlayFab, and they're getting better every day, right? And so I think that's the exciting thing to me is now we're getting to a point where with multiplayer games, game developers can go focus on the fun of the game rather than having to focus on the really hard job of building tech. And so I think that's what's exciting to me, is that we're going to see even better games because the tooling is going to be even better. And so we'll see cooler and cooler games as all of this stuff becomes more and more commoditized and people focus less on the old tech and the building of the core tech, and they focus more on the actual fun of building games. And the great thing is there's always going to be new tech to go build, right? Like we'll always figure out, like we'll start taking these as primitives and building cooler stuff on top of this stuff. And like that's the exciting part to me, is that commoditization and allowing game developers to focus on more interesting, harder problems that bring greater joy and delight to the players.
Well, I think that's a great note to end the fire chat set on. I think we went through quite a few topics. Hopefully, people watching can take some of the learnings from this. Yeah, many thanks, guys, for sharing this from your perspectives. Um, that's it. Thank you very much.
We're going to do any Q&A, Seb?
Yeah, I'm waiting for the Q&A to
Yes.
jump in.
So,
I think we have a bunch of questions waiting.
thank you so much, first and foremost, for this incredible fireside chat. As I announced earlier, there's probably going to be a couple of questions coming in as we wrap up and as we announce that we're coming to an end. But there was a question earlier from Katarina, who I want to bring into the spotlight here, as she asked, what is considered a fair experience for the players in multiplayers, for example, co-op, PvP, in the eyes of the experienced ones?
Can you
I'm not
repeat
sure.
that last bit? In the
Yeah.
eyes of the experience.
Oh no, as in in your eyes, as those who have basically been in
I see.
multiplayer for so
In
long.
From our perspective.
Yeah, when she asks about experience, is that like latency or ping or like what? I'm curious to get a little bit of clarification. Or Brian, maybe you got an answer ready. Yeah.
No, sorry.
Yeah.
I think I missed it. Could you repeat the question real quick?
Absolutely. The question in its entirety: what is considered a quote fair experience unquote for the players in multiplayer, maybe co-op, PvP, in your eyes?
Fair experience.
Okay,
So
fair
you mean
experience.
like a proper online experience when you're playing a co-op or multiplayer game? And yeah, you as Steven said, how do you define it? Like, do you define it in latency, or do you define it as it's a fun game to play?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's. I think it's.
Go ahead.
I was just because I think it's a couple of things. Like, I think fairness is one of the most important pieces there, and so you've definitely got to take into account, depending on the type of game you're making, you've got to take into account the inequalities between console, mobile, and PC. So, for example, it's fairly rare to find first-person shooters that match make PC and console together because mouse and keyboard is statistically more accurate than a controller is, right? And so I think fairness is one of the very first pieces of that of the answer. And then I think the second one is latency, is just like, because again, latency goes back to fairness, because you want players that have similar pings playing against each other. I remember, this is a really old story, but I remember hosting a Counter-Strike, like really early beta Counter-Strike server way back in the day. And the reason I loved hosting it was because I had like a 10 millisecond ping because I was on the LAN with the Counter-Strike server, and everybody else on dial-up had like a 200 millisecond ping, and it was completely unfair. And it was a lot of fun. So like, and that inequality still exists today, right? So you have to like go out of your way as a game developer to try to have your matchmaker take ping into account, latency into account, in order to try to make the matches as fair as possible. And then the other thing I'll say real quick about matchmaking, like, the job of the matchmaker is to try to find the best possible play experience for every single player involved, right? And so that's why you have elo ratings, or that's why you have like rankings, and that's why you take into account regions, you take into account latency, you take into account all of those things in order so that like the meta or the strategic point of a matchmaker is to try to find the best play experience possible for the players. And with that, Brian, I kind of cut you off. Sorry.
Oh, you hit all the points. Yeah. I can give a similarly old reference of my brother used to run the local bulletin board system, the BBS, that people would dial up into, and he had a bunch of games on there. But our phone lines would be tied up, so I'd be able to go on the local computer and get all my daily game updates in without having to wait in line. So that was my way of cheating, because the server was in the house.
That's awesome.
Another question that I found particularly interesting is actually from Ender Rice, who asks, "Hello, each of you are reachable as consultants?" Question mark.
Are we reachable as consultants? Question mark.
Mm-hmm.
I love
what's
talking about
what
this
was-
stuff. Yeah, I love talking about this stuff. So I'm happy to like share knowledge or casually chat or whatever. I'm not like looking for consulting gigs now, but I'm happy to always like share information and share knowledge.
Same boat here as well. Yeah, I always enjoyed chatting about this stuff, and yeah, especially if it's a small indie game trying to figure out how to navigate that stuff, I can definitely share some thoughts and pointers. Yeah, might know actual consultants out there, different types too. So.
That actually opens up the question: is there a platform actually for people who are trying to actually communicate about that? Do you know of any?
That is interesting. Yeah, what the watering holes are for folks in the game services multiplayer world.
well,
We built
there are
our
Discord
netcode.
communities, and well, we know of Discord communities that, but that's more for the indie area, I guess. There are a bunch of
Right.
those.
There's a lot of platform specific ones. So if you choose a tool that has an either open source community or a web service community, there'll often be a good Discord around that with people. Like we use Photon for our netcode, and they have a solid Discord community and Q&A place. PlayFab has a nice Q&A forum out there too, where people are.
Incredible. Thank you all so much for that. Since this is the end of the questions that have come in, do you, as each of you individuals, do you have something that you would love to add as a final note, basically?
Final note. I think from my perspective, it is always watch out for the single points of failure.
Can you elaborate on that? Because I find that an incredibly intriguing sentence to just leave at.
Well, from my perspective, of course, here at Gameye, we always look at where are the single points of failure.
Mm-hmm.
So building what we've built so far has never gone down, based on the team looking at what are the single points of failure, where are we, can we be proactive. So yeah, always look at for single points of failure. If you choose something that is able to go down, you have no full control over it, and you cannot move away from it. Yeah, it's very scary, especially when you build multiplayer games.
Mm-hmm.
Downtime is something, it's the biggest nightmare of everything.
Yeah.
And in this industry, they will not treat you lightly if your game is down. You will see it in the reviews, you will see it on Twitter, and it hurts a lot.
Yeah, I think I think I would second that. Like, I think the most important aspect is early in the early days, like 15 years ago, multiplayer before games as a service was really a sustainable or like a widely used business model. Multiplayer was viewed a lot more casually, right? And games going down and things like that, it was like, oh well, all right, I'm just going to pick on Blizzard and World of Warcraft. Like World of Warcraft is down for a few hours, but it's probably not going to cost them really any money because people are not going to cancel their subscriptions over it, right? And in fact, Blizzard would actually give you extra days. Like if they were down long enough, they would give you extra days to make up for it. And I think the really interesting thing now is with free-to-play business models, that the vital thing for all developers to keep in mind is that like downtime is now a core business concern. Downtime now actually does cost you money and cost you customers. And so thinking of, especially for like all the tech directors out there and all the engineers out there, thinking about how you keep your game up and operational and thinking about how you make sure that you have redundancy in every mission critical system, which is also why I bring up mission critical systems earlier, because you don't necessarily, and it's not always practical to invest in redundancy in every single system, right? But it is really a core business concern, and you've really got to view it through that lens of this is actually how I operate my business now. And so I need to make sure that we have these things in place in order for me to be able to like capitalize on revenue or to not lose revenue when we have issues.
Yeah, and don't have multiple. If you must have single points of failure, try not to have multiple single points of failure. It's more fuel for your nightmares, and yeah, I guess also consider what the single points of failure, what they're like. Are they, what are they doing on their end, or kind of what are the characteristics of that single point of failure? Is it something you can recover from, or point the variable to some other location and fix? Yeah, it's good thing to think about.
Incredible.
And I guess for my final note, I'll say don't let any of this dissuade anyone out there who's thinking of getting into multiplayer games. I think Steven's note about the fact that yeah, we converted our single player game to multiplayer knowing that it was going to be scary, but we learned so much and it's a lot of fun. There's a ton of players out there that now are enjoying our game all day every day, probably too much, some of them. And yeah, I think it was still definitely worth it. And I think to what Steven was saying about the tools getting better, and just the ecosystem growing and building these primitives you can build on top of, I think it's never been easier and more and less painful to create multiplayer games than right now, and it's only going to get better over the coming years.
Hell yeah. The three of you, Sebastian, Stephen, Brian, thank you so much for imparting your wisdom on all the people out there. Thank you for, being with us here at the Devcom Summits, at the Tech and Tools Summit specifically. That was great. Thank you so much.